This is a presentation on software, or about how Bitcoin will impact on the future of warfare. And I'm going to break this presentation into 4 key areas. To begin with, we'll take a look at what Bitcoin is, because people have varying ideas. Unless you're using Bitcoin, you probably don't really understand quite what it is and what it isn't. We'll give you an introduction to the SOFTWAR Thesis, and then I'll show how the Bitcoin network operates. It's important that even for a layperson you have an understanding of the operation of the network in order to understand how that will impact on future warfare. So I'm going to start with a question that we'll leave hanging. Over Christmas of 2023, Vladimir Putin goes to Ethiopia and sets up a deal with the Ethiopian government to use all of their electricity coming out of their new River Nile hydroelectric power station. It's one of the largest infrastructure projects in the world. And he uses this power, he sets up a deal to build a 30,000 square meter Bitcoin mining operation. It's one of the largest Bitcoin mines in the world. So there's 2 questions here. 1, what does Vladimir Putin want with Bitcoin? And 2, why in Ethiopia? Why go to Africa? Surely he can mine Bitcoin at home. I think the answer to this lies in software. So we'll leave this question hanging for a moment. We'll answer it by the end. Firstly, we look at what Bitcoin is. In its simplest form, Bitcoin allows value to be transferred over the internet from person A to person B without anybody being involved. There's no bank, no credit card, no PayPal, no Western Union. We'll show that with a little lady in Costa Rica with her market stall. She's going to put the price in and take payment. So that was done without any bank or any financial institution in between. There are 1.4 billion people who are unbanked. That's not because they're poor, it's because they are rural and the banking infrastructure never reached them. But now they're able to take and make digital payments using an app on their telephone. They don't need any extra requirements. All they need is their phone and an access to the internet. What Bitcoin isn't is cryptocurrency. These are businesses with management teams that are profit driven. They use the same underlying technology. You'll often hear Bitcoin and crypto used in the same way, but they are 2 entirely different things, as much as any business is different to gold. They are just completely different products. So if it says cryptocurrency, that's something to be avoided. So the SOFTWAR Thesis begins with this man. This is Major Jason Lowry of the US Space Force. He is a specialist in electronics warfare. And he goes to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to take his PhD, thinking about this idea that you can't fight the next war using the technology of the last. And he does a deep dive into Bitcoin. And he has this epiphany moment, because he is viewing Bitcoin not as a financial system, but as a war-fighting system. So he's come at it from a very different approach. And in his epiphany, he realizes that Bitcoin can do 3 things quite well. It leads to a new type of power projection. It leads to non-lethal or less lethal warfare. And it imposes high physical costs on an adversary. And he writes his thesis on this idea, but he leaves a lot of blanks. He doesn't really explain how Bitcoin does this. The Bitcoin community understood straight away, but Lowry didn't really explain it. I think there's a failure on his part. So he writes this thesis and says, Bitcoin changes everything about warfare. Writes his thesis, puts it into the Department of Defense. They look at it and they just don't understand. So it ends up gathering dust. He asks if he can publish it. It goes through the review process and they said, yes, sure, you can publish that. The thesis goes out and the Bitcoin community get it and think it's the best thing since sliced bread. They love it. China gets hold of it, reverses their Bitcoin policy. Russia gets hold of it, reverses their Bitcoin policy. Suddenly countries are changing. The BRICS in particular are changing, and it's down to software. So the Department of Defense goes back, looks at their look at what they've put out, and then Lowry himself comes on Twitter saying, I was ordered to take SOFTWAR down and asked to stop talking about the subject publicly. Things are good, I'm working hard behind the scenes. But the Department of Defense made a strategic mistake. They've just allowed out something that was actually quite important because they didn't understand it. And about 3,000 copies of the thesis were released. They typically go for £2,000 to £3,000, £10,000 at the top end. There was no digital copy that had been released. So we have to ask, what did the Department of Defense miss? What was it that they didn't understand? And you can't really blame the Department of Defense because most people don't understand. It's the mathematicians and computer scientists who are involved in Bitcoin who understood. Lowry hadn't quite explained it, but the geeks and the tech people, they got it straight away. So let's have a look. The key concept is that they understand that Bitcoin is monetized energy. Now that might sound like buzzwords, but what it means is if you are an energy producer and you can produce energy in any way, you can mine Bitcoin. If you're an energy producer and you have some kind of excess energy, or for example, if you're an oil rig in the North Sea and you are gas flaring, so you're burning off this excess gas, you can actually turn that into Bitcoin and sell it. So it's money for old rope. Larry realized that all modern wars have been fought over energy, or energy resources. And importantly, the political power of the banks, it's been drained away from them because this technology goes around them, as we saw with the lady in Costa Rica. She doesn't need a bank. So the political power is moving away from the banks, and the energy producers are now getting this asset for free. So I'll show a few videos to give a better explanation of that. And we can see it by looking at the supply and demand. So we'll begin by going to Kenya, where these are our Bitcoin mining machines in a little hut somewhere, and it's a field in Kenya by a fast-flowing river. So this is a tiny hydroelectric station that is providing a small amount of electricity for the local community. But there is some extra, and that excess energy is now going to mine Bitcoin. So they end up with a saleable asset at the end of it. No extra energy was produced. It was clean energy, and it didn't cost anything. At the other end of the spectrum, this is a nuclear power station in Pennsylvania. Power stations typically produce more power than is required, and this is because they may have sudden surges in demand. So in the past, they would produce this excess energy, which was wasted, just went straight into the ground. What they do now is they plug that into the Bitcoin mining machines. Again, no extra energy is produced. This is already existing energy that wasn't being used, and now it's being turned into Bitcoin. So we'll have a look at demand. We know about the 1.4 billion unbanked people, but there is also this video I'm going to show is Tucker Carlson went to Argentina about 2 weeks before Javier Milei was won the election to become president.
We just got buzzed in after waiting outside for a while and trying to change a $100 bill.
Okay, how many money do you expect are you going to receive?
I don't know.
More or less, guess.
Enough to keep my door from closing, a doorstop. Well, now I feel rich.
This is like Mad Max of caves. Don't seem like that?
That is... So how much is that worth? Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so these three charts I've pulled up, these were taken in January 2024. I just took the price of Bitcoin in Turkish lira, in Nigeria and Egypt, to show the local currency that Bitcoin was hitting all-time highs in the price of Bitcoin. That isn't because Bitcoin was rising in value. It's because those currencies are collapsing so quickly. In fact, from February 2024, Japan, the Japanese yen, also started to see Bitcoin hitting all-time highs because the currency is collapsing. This is all the excess monetary printing that was done over COVID, even from as far back as 2008, which never really stopped. The amount of monetary printing and the loose monetary policy has led to this inflation, and in certain places to hyperinflation. And traditionally what you would do, if you were the man about town in Buenos Aires, you got paid in your Argentinian pesos, you would exchange it for dollars, or maybe for gold, or even euros. But now you can exchange it for Bitcoin with a swipe on your telephone. So now it's much easier to get out of your local currency and into something else. So when we talk about the demand of Bitcoin, there is the unbanked, there are the speculators who are trying to make money, but it is this area, this key demographic of people trying to get away from hyperinflation that is making the most inroads. So we have a look at how Bitcoin works. It begins with these machines called ASICs. These are similar to your computer at home, but instead of being a jack of all trades, they just do one thing, and they do it really well, which is number crunching. And these machines, anyone can buy one. You plug it into the internet, it forms a haphazard network. They all talk to one another. And what they're actually doing, let's have a look. This is the Bitcoin network in real time. The blocks you see falling down the screen are transactions that are coming in. It's people transferring money from one to another. And the space at the bottom of the screen we call the mempool. These are unverified. So we end up with these unverified transactions. Those Bitcoin mining machines start verifying them, and it's completely random who verifies which transaction. You need 5 verifications, and once you've got the 5, it's considered true. That transaction really happened. About every 10 minutes, those mempool transactions will move to the middle of the screen where you see the big orange block, and this is where the fun starts to happen. The Bitcoin miners are trying to solve a difficult mathematical problem, and they use that block of transactions as their starting point. That's their starting number, and that's the start. They have a solution, and they need to calculate the maths in between to get from the start to the solution. But this maths is quite clever. It's a one-way street, and there's no way to solve it. You have to brute force try every possible combination, and who gets there first wins. It's like a lottery, and it's completely random who wins. So it's random in who verifies the transactions, and it's random in who gets to solve the block. But whoever solves that block gets paid. They get paid in Bitcoin for doing so. We'll have a maths quiz. This was my epiphany moment when I saw this. This is the distribution formula for Bitcoin. And what it says is for the first 4 years, pay out 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. This is not like US dollars or British pounds where you can just turn on the printing press and print as many as you want. Precisely 10 minutes, 50 Bitcoin were coming out for 4 years. And then it dropped. After 4 years, it dropped down to 25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. 4 years later, it dropped down to 12.5, then to 6.25. From April 2024, it will drop down to 3. And what this means is after 128 years, you will have 21 million Bitcoin. No more, no less. It is precise, it is mathematical. Very different from central banks that can just print money out of thin air. This is a hard asset, and we understand precisely the distribution schedule. We know when it's coming out, we know how much is coming out, we know when it changes. And this gives the network some very interesting properties. First of all, Bitcoin is now the most powerful computer network in the world. If you took all the data centers for Google, Microsoft and Amazon, combined them, that can't even make a dent in Bitcoin. It's never been hacked, and that's because it's not built like a traditional computer system. Ordinarily, you would have a door with a lock, with a keyhole, and if you have the key, or if you can pick the lock, you can access the system. Bitcoin has no key, no lock. You need brute force, lots of energy, and random luck in order to be able to write a block. It's not open any other way. It's a finite resource, so the Bitcoin asset, like I said, will only be 21 million. It's based on maths, it's based on rules. It's a piece of code. Nobody's in charge of it, it's just lots of computers running the same piece of code, which means that there is no government in control. There's no central point. There is nobody making the rules or deciding the policy. It just is. It's a piece of code. It cannot be censored, it cannot be altered, and it cannot be turned off. Now the way this works with those blocks that you saw, the block of transactions, the reason we call it a blockchain is you start with a block. When the second block is added to it, the whole chain is mathematically signed, and then a new block is added, the whole chain is mathematically signed. This means you can't go back and change something that happened earlier. It just wouldn't work. So there's a permanent transaction record. This is why it's so false and fake when the central banks say that only criminals use it. Criminals hate Bitcoin because it has a permanent transaction record. If you committed a crime 10 years ago with Bitcoin, the proof cannot be erased. Finally, it can survive a nuclear war, and it really can. If you wanted to try and stop Bitcoin now, you would have to shut down all the power, shut down the internet, and then try and find all 5 million Bitcoin mining machines, destroy them, destroy all the nodes, destroy all the validators, and then really hope that nobody kept a copy of the blockchain for when you turn it back on. Otherwise it will all just come back. To show the size of Bitcoin now, this is the top assets by market cap. So gold is the top, the largest asset on earth, followed by Microsoft, Apple, Saudi Aramco, and then down here at number 10 is Bitcoin. So we now have Bitcoin as the 10th largest asset on the planet. The world's biggest computer network, or most powerful computer network, and the 10th largest asset. So again, when central banks are telling you it's tulips and it's going to zero, I don't think you should listen. So let's just recap on that. Bitcoin is monetized energy. If you have energy, if you have excess energy especially, you can produce Bitcoin. There's been a gold rush in the last few years of people looking for stranded energy. So things like gas fields where they're doing gas flaring. If you're actually oil rigs now in the middle of the North Sea are mining Bitcoin from the gas flaring. So if you have energy, you have Bitcoin. Political power is moving away from the central banks and it's moving into the hands of the energy producers. The fiat monetary system is eroding because of all of this excess monetary printing. There's so much money sloshing around the system, but it's worthless. It's paper. Fiat currency is on its way out. And importantly, the petrodollar system is eroding. Petrodollar says that if you want oil, you must buy it in dollars. So you need to buy dollars first. But of late, and especially the Biden administration, have weaponized the petrodollar to such an extent that the energy producers are now looking for a different way to operate. Russia was locked out of dollars for being able to sell its energy. They were even locked out of the SWIFT banking network. They want an alternative. You've got Iran with large natural gas reserves, locked out of the petrodollar, under sanctions. They want a different way to go about their business. And they now have this new currency that is based on energy that they are getting simply by their excess product. They've now got this permissionless system. They don't need the United States and they don't need the petrodollar. And that's leading to a very scary question for the West, which is, what if oil was priced in Bitcoin? Or what if energy was priced in Bitcoin? Well, what we're seeing is energy is being priced in Bitcoin. Energy and Bitcoin are symbiotic now. The energy sector has been has ingratiated Bitcoin network more than the financial system. So our current banks are trying to reject Bitcoin and the energy sector is embracing it. And that's going to cause problems, especially when it comes to warfare, because now if you have to pay for your energy with Bitcoin, what happens when you have to pay for your military with Bitcoin? So Lowry's ideas of power projection theory. In the olden days, the way you wanted to project power was, if for America turned up with a carrier battle group. You go and put some troops along somebody's border. You're projecting your power. But in the future, if you have to pay for your military with Bitcoin, maybe you don't want to deploy them until you really have to. So it's better to have the Bitcoin ready to go. So you have the Bitcoin that you can convert into military power rather than have the military power. At the moment, the reason we have military power the way we do is because it's paid for by, in the US, by printing dollars or by issuing bonds and passing the cost on to a future generation. But Bitcoin is a finite asset. You can only ever be 21 million. How many Bitcoin are you going to have? And do you really want to be spending it on a military that you're not really using? Or do you want to just keep the Bitcoin ready? Keep your powder dry. Second, a non-lethal warfare or a less lethal warfare. If you're paying for military action in Bitcoin, there is not going to be a 20-year war in Afghanistan. You want this over in a weekend. It needs to be as fast and as cheap as possible, because any lengthy campaign is going to be a drain on your resources. And finally, you have to think that in order to even engage in any kind of conflict, there is a real cost now. You can't print dollars to pay for your warfare. You have to use a finite asset. Now there's a real cost. There's a second part to this, actually, that Lowresy discusses in SOFTWAR about imposing physical costs, in that because the Bitcoin network has never been hacked, he suggests that maybe the Pentagon should be building a similar system to protect its own data, that you can't access this thing by hacking it. You can only access it by producing huge amounts of energy. So there's a real cost to just even access the system. But we can now go back and look at the original question. Vladimir Putin is off in Africa. He's talking to the government of Ethiopia about their River Nile hydroelectric dam project. And he sets up a deal to build one of the world's biggest Bitcoin mines. Why did he do it? Why did Putin go to Africa to mine Bitcoin? And I think the answer is so that we can't. Putin has realized that this is an important strategic asset. Putin also realizes he's been shut out of the dollar, he's been shut out of the SWIFT banking network, and he understands that most of the Bitcoin mining equipment at the moment is centered in North America, and he needs his own access to the system. So the BRICS countries, are building out their Bitcoin infrastructure very, very quickly. Meanwhile, in the West, we're dragging our heels. We're almost asleep at the wheel. And I think the reason for that is down to the central banks really trying to hold on to their power and telling everybody, don't use Bitcoin, it's a flash in the pan, it's a Ponzi scheme, you'll lose all of your money. And they're saying that to try and hold on to their unelected political power for as long as possible. But by doing that, and by listening to them, the BRICS are now about to take over in a very real way, because they will now hold the biggest, hardest asset. Many of the BRICS countries are energy producers themselves. So the seesaw is moving. The power, the unelected political power that the central banks had, is now moving very decisively towards the energy producers. And that is why Bitcoin will have an impact on the way wars are fought in the future.